She absorbed his condescension like a sponge absorbs water, head slightly bowed, watching her hands instead of his face. He didn't see the calluses on her palms from holding weapons. He didn't see the scars mapping her ribs like topographic lines of a war he'd only read about in journals. He didn't see the legend whispered in Tikrit as Angel 6, the nurse who pulled 3 senators' sons from a black site that officially never existed. Dr. Mercer saw only what he wanted to see, a competent but replaceable nurse who needed reminding of the hierarchy. What he didn't know was that Natalie Hayes barely existed at all. Natalie moved through Cedar Creek Medical's pediatric wing on a Tuesday morning in late September, her compression socks silent against the tile floor. 8 months into her civilian posting at the San Antonio hospital, she still flinched at the wrong sounds. The rhythmic beeping of monitors felt too clean, too safe, too far from the percussion of incoming fire and the wet sound of chest tubes saving lives under mortar rounds. The hospital's antiseptic smell burned her nostrils, sharper than the cordite and copper air of field hospitals in Tikrit and Helmand province. She checked the vitals on 7-year-old Marcus Chen in bed for, fingers steady as she peeled back the blood pressure cuff. No tremor. No hesitation. The muscle memory was too ingrained for civilian work to shake it loose. Her jacket hung in the break room locker, and inside the lining, sewn tight against the fabric with sutures that would hold in a hurricane, was the faded patch from 75th Ranger Regiment. Not her unit, but close enough. The patch pressed against her ribs when she moved, a second heartbeat, a constant reminder of who she had been when the Pentagon decided Captain Natalie Hayes needed to stop existing. She brushed her fingers against the fabric during her rounds, a gesture no different than someone touching a wedding ring or a religious medal. Muscle memory of a different kind. The morning was routine until the elevator doors opened at 08 for 7 hours. Commander Davidson stepped into the pediatric ward with a small boy holding his left hand. The boy was 7, maybe 8, thin-shouldered and careful with his steps. Both of his eyes were wrapped in surgical gauze, cream-colored and thick, held in place by medical tape that had already started yellowing at the edges. His right shoulder, visible where his hospital gown slipped during the nurse's intake assessment, bore a single tattoo in neat block letters, Angel 6. Natalie's breath caught. She didn't stop moving. She didn't turn. She finished documenting vitals on Marcus Chen and walked past them toward the supply closet with the casual stride of someone who had zero reason to look twice at a Navy SEAL and his blinded son. But her left hand, the one with the scar tissue running down the palm, pressed briefly against her jacket lining as she passed. The patch was still there. The patch was always there. Commander Davidson's eyes tracked her. She felt them the way you feel someone aiming a rifle at your back, a specific kind of attention, weighted and deliberate. But he said nothing. His son squeezed his hand and asked, "Dad, is someone here?" "Yes," the commander said quietly. "Someone's here." Dr. Richard Mercer appeared from the neurology consultation room exactly 43 seconds later. He was tall, the kind of tall that required him to lower his chin when entering doorways, with the silver-threaded hair of a man who had convinced himself that his age was wisdom instead of simply the accumulation of years. He wore a tailored coat over his scrubs, a gesture that separated him from the nursing staff in ways both visible and deliberate. His watch was expensive. Natalie clocked it at roughly $12,000, a Rolex Submariner with the kind of patina that came from inherited family money, not earned wealth. She had been trained to notice these details. Threat assessment was involuntary now. Mercer's face shifted the moment he saw Natalie. Not overtly. Just a slight tightening around his eyes, a microscopic adjustment of his posture. She had seen this before in different contexts, the moment a predator recognizes a threat. But his threat assessment was wrong. He was reading her competence as arrogance. Her composure as coldness. Her refusal to defer to his credentials as insubordination. He didn't see the hands that had performed needle decompressions under mortar fire. He didn't see the scar tissue on her shoulders from the rucksack straps of gear that weighed more than a child. He didn't see the legend whispered in Tikrit as Angel 6, the one who came in when the docks froze, the one who didn't hesitate, the one who'd extracted Commander Davidson from a burning supply truck with rounds tearing through the metal like paper. "Commander," Mercer said, extending his hand. His voice carried the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Welcome to Cedar Creek. Your son is in excellent hands. I'm Dr. Richard Mercer, head of pediatric ophthalmology. We'll get to the bottom of his visual function." "Appreciate that, Doctor," the commander said. Natalie recognized the cadence, the controlled courtesy of a man used to giving orders, now forced to accept the limitations of civilian hierarchy. "When can we discuss treatment options?" "Once I complete my examination," Mercer said. He glanced at Natalie without actually looking at her, the way you glance past furniture. "Nurse Hayes will get your son settled. Basic vitals. Intake. Nothing complex." The boy's name was Thomas. 7 years old. IED shrapnel from the same attack in Tikrit that had killed 2 other families, 16 civilians total, according to what Commander Davidson didn't say but what Natalie read in the briefing that had appeared in her secure email 3 days before they arrived. The shrapnel had taken his sight cleanly. No retinal damage. No optic nerve injury. The damage was structural, corneal scarring, anterior chamber disruption, traumatic hyphema that had mostly resolved. Multiple treatment pathways existed. Mercer would choose one. Natalie settled Thomas into bed 7, her movements deliberate and gentle, no rushed efficiency. The boy was scared. Fear has a smell, a copper-salt combination that compounds when mixed with a child's anxiety, and Natalie could smell it beneath the antiseptic and the hospital-standard lavender soap his father had probably used to wash him this morning, trying to give his blinded son some sense of normalcy. She took his vitals. BP 108/68. Pulse 94. O2 sat 99% on room air. Everything normal. Everything devastated. "Can you still hear okay?" she asked him. "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "Everything's just really loud now. I can hear the machines and the people and," he paused. "I can't see them." "Your ears work just fine," Natalie said. She didn't offer false reassurance about his vision. She didn't promise that everything would be okay. She had learned, over 12 years and 3 combat tours, that children could smell lies. "You're in pediatrics. That means we've got a whole unit of people whose job is keeping kids alive and as comfortable as possible. I'm Natalie. I'll be checking on you every 4 hours." Thomas nodded. His hand found the railing of the bed and held it. Small fingers, tensed. Mercer's examination took 37 minutes. Natalie reshelved supplies in the medication cart, checking for catheters, organizing antibiotic bottles, running mental inventory of what they had available, and stayed positioned where she could observe without appearing to observe. A skill from previous employment. Mercer used a slit lamp. Used dilating drops. Ran through basic visual acuity tests that Thomas couldn't pass because Thomas couldn't see. Mercer's face showed no expression, but Natalie caught the moment when his clinical assessment solidified. She read it in the angle of his shoulders, the specific way he removed his gloves. Corneal scarring. Anterior chamber reconstruction possible. Corneal graft pathway. Photorefractive keratotomy pathway. Artificial cornea pathway. 3 separate treatment protocols, each with different recovery times, different complication rates, different costs. Mercer would recommend one. He would do it with absolute authority and with no consultation of the literature that Natalie had already read at 0300 hours on 3 separate nights, unable to sleep because the boy with her call sign on his shoulder had come into the hospital blinded. When Commander Davidson met Natalie in the hallway outside Thomas's room, his eyes held hers for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for full eye contact, not so long as to be obvious to the staff walking past with their coffee cups and their charts and their clinical detachment. His hand landed on her shoulder, fingers pressing against the jacket fabric, and for one moment his thumb brushed against the spot where the patch was sewn underneath. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For 8 months ago. And for now." Natalie didn't respond. She couldn't. Any response would be confirmation of something that officially never happened. Instead she nodded once, very slightly, and said in the soft deferential voice she had cultivated like a second skin, "Your son's in good care, Commander." But as she walked back toward the medication cart, her hand found the patch again. It was still there. The patch was always there. And somewhere in her chest, beneath the ribs marked with scars, something that had been dormant for 8 months began to wake up. The room went dead silent. Dr. Mercer stood at the foot of the boy's bed with the chart held like a weapon, his voice pitched deliberately loud enough for Commander Davidson to hear every syllable. "Ms. Hayes, your interpretation of these scans is amateur at best. Frankly, it's concerning." He didn't look at her directly, didn't give her the dignity of eye contact, he performed for the father instead, pointing at the imaging with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. "The optic nerve damage here is irreversible. Total blindness. The standard of care is management, not," he paused, letting the silence stretch, "not whatever experimental theories a floor nurse might conjure up." Natalie stood 3 feet away, her hands at her sides, her breathing exactly where it had been before he started speaking. She'd learned long ago that flinching was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. One measured breath. That was all she permitted herself. She met his eyes for 1 second, just long enough for him to see she'd heard, and then she looked away, the submissive gesture he wanted. Her badge hung against her scrubs, ordinary and forgettable. 8 months of this. 8 months of being Natalie Hayes, RN, a woman with no history before arriving at Cedar Creek Medical, no call signs, no silver stars gathering dust in a storage unit 6 miles from here. Commander Davidson's jaw tightened. He'd recognized something in her movements that morning, something in the way she'd assessed his son's condition with the efficiency of someone who'd operated under fire, but he said nothing. Not here. Not with Mercer performing. The next afternoon, the break room fell silent the moment Natalie pushed through the door. She'd watched it happen before, the phenomenon of professional abandonment. Conversations mid-sentence would simply stop. A nurse named Rodriguez, who'd been friendly enough to smile at her on Mondays, suddenly remembered an urgent call from the lab. A resident stood abruptly, his tray half full, claiming he needed to review charts. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her head as she poured black coffee into a ceramic mug that had been at Cedar Creek longer than she had. The liquid was still hot, but she could already taste how cold it would become by the time she left. Mercer's whispered campaign had taken root. She heard fragments, not directed at her, never directly, but designed to land where they'd burrow deepest. "Can't understand why administration hired her without proper credentials / she's been here how long? 8 months / thinks she's a doctor." The words were bacteria in the ventilation system, infecting everything they touched. 3 days later, Natalie discovered the write-up posted on the unit bulletin board beside the staff schedule and the cafeteria menu. The notice was printed on official Cedar Creek letterhead, Dr. Mercer's signature slashed across the bottom in aggressive blue ink. Overstepping clinical boundaries. Unauthorized patient counseling. Lack of deference to supervising physicians. The words hung there like a verdict, documented and permanent. She read it twice. The first time, she felt the ghost of something she thought she'd buried, anger that tasted like copper and came from a place where Captain Natalie Hayes still existed. The second time, she noticed the small grammatical error in the 3rd paragraph, the word protocols misspelled as proccols. Humans made mistakes. Even department heads. Even men with 15 years of institutional power. One tear escaped before she could stop it, sliding down her cheek without permission. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a gesture so quick that passing staff might not have noticed. Might not have. "Powerful move," she heard Mercer's voice behind her, smooth as oil over water. "Documenting your pattern of insubordination for the record. The board appreciates documentation." Natalie turned to face him. Her hands hung at her sides, steady as surgical steel. The rage was still there, still alive, but she'd learned to let it settle into her bones instead of her face. The treatment literature on pediatric optic nerve regeneration, the 3-pathway approach, I left copies in your mailbox 2 weeks ago. With the citations. Her voice came out level, conversational. Funny that you dismissed all three options without consulting the evidence. Mercer's satisfied smirk faltered for just a moment, enough time for her to see the calculation happen behind his eyes. He leaned closer, and she could smell the coffee on his breath, the expensive cologne that probably cost more than her weekly salary. His voice dropped to something venomous, meant for her ears only. You think I'm worried about what some floor nurse left in my mailbox? I've been at Cedar Creek for 15 years. You've been here 8 months. Who do you think the board believes, a department head with 3 published papers, or a woman who appears in my files with no prior employment history before 18 months ago? The threat was there, buried under the words like shrapnel. She understood it perfectly. He was probing for weakness, testing whether she had vulnerabilities beyond the professional ones. The absence of a past. The lack of references that could be verified beyond the sanitized version she'd provided. He'd already started making calls, she could feel it in the precision of his words, the confidence of a man who'd already begun dismantling her. I wonder, Natalie said, her voice dropping an octave, what the state medical board would think about your dismissal of 3 evidence-based treatment protocols without consultation. That's documented. Right here. She tapped the write-up once, her finger landing on the space where he'd listed her supposed offense. I have the literature. Timestamps. And I'm betting your mailbox still has the original copies. With your name on them now. The color drained from Mercer's face in a way that would have been satisfying if she'd been the kind of person who took satisfaction in things anymore. He straightened, and when he spoke again, the venom was replaced with something worse, the cold professionalism of institutional power. This conversation is over, Ms. Hayes. I suggest you focus on your job before there is no job to focus on. He walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway with purpose. Behind him, Natalie stood in front of the bulletin board, reading the write-up one more time. The misspelled word stared back at her, protocols. She memorized it, the way soldiers memorize details that might matter later. That evening, when the shift ended and the parking lot lights threw long shadows across the asphalt, Natalie sat in her truck, a 2008 Ford F-150 with a Texas license plate and a history that belonged to someone named Patricia Westover, a woman who died in a car accident in Corpus Christi and never needed her identity again. She pulled the faded unit patch from the inside pocket of her jacket, the one she'd kept sewn into the lining since the day she arrived in San Antonio. 75th Ranger Regiment. The stitching was coming loose on one corner, threads fraying from 18 months of concealment. She turned it over in her hands, letting the weight of it settle in her palm. Back when that patch meant something, when she'd worn it on her sleeve instead of hiding it like contraband, she'd been someone different. Captain Natalie Hayes. Operational security. 3 deployments. The kind of person who didn't flinch when things went wrong. The kind of person who didn't let men like Mercer push her into corners. Her phone sat on the passenger seat, dark and silent. It was a burner, untraceable, with exactly 4 numbers programmed into it. One of those numbers went to a Pentagon office that technically didn't exist. One went to a handler who'd made it clear that using that number meant ending everything she'd built, the apartment, the fake history, the civilian life that had become almost comfortable. Those were the rules when you extracted people from black sites and helped senators' sons disappear from classified prisons. When you became a ghost, you stayed a ghost. But ghosts could bleed. And ghosts could be destroyed by men like Mercer who thought they held all the power because they'd never served anything larger than themselves. Natalie reached for the jacket pocket where the unit patch lived. Her fingers brushed the fraying thread, and she made a decision. Not yet. Not until she was certain. Not until there was no other choice. But the time was coming. She could feel it in the way Mercer had looked at her, in the confidence of his threat, in the systematic way he was building his case against her. He didn't understand who he was pushing into a corner. But that was a lesson that was still being written. The monitors started singing a different song at 2:36 p.m. Thomas Davidson had been sitting in the ophthalmology chair for routine examination, follow-up imaging, visual acuity testing, standard protocol. The kind of appointment that happens in quiet rooms with soft lighting and whispered conversations about prognosis. Commander Davidson stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching his son's face for any sign of discomfort, for any hope that sight might return where shrapnel had stolen it. Natalie stood just outside the doorway, excluded by Mercer's explicit order from the previous afternoon, basic tasks only, Miss Hayes. Charting, vitals. Dr. Mercer handles the complex cases. The words were still warm, still sharp. Then Thomas's oxygen saturation started dropping. The beeping accelerated, not the lazy rhythm of baseline monitoring but the urgent staccato that made every head turn. 68. 65. 62. The numbers fell like a countdown to something terrible. Natalie moved first, muscle memory recognizing the pattern before conscious thought had time to catch up. She was already in the room when Dr. Mercer looked up from his chart, confusion flickering across his face like he didn't understand why the alarms were talking. "He's breathing," the commander said, voice tight. "Something's wrong with his breathing." The child's small chest rose asymmetrically, the left side barely moving while the right side heaved with compensatory effort. Air hunger written in the desperate angle of his ribs. Natalie's hands were already moving, palpating, assessing, her fingers reading what the monitors were only beginning to scream. The trachea had shifted. Subtle, maybe 3 millimeters, but enough. Tension pneumothorax. A rib fragment from the original shrapnel injury, something the initial imaging had missed, something that had been silently waiting in the child's chest for weeks, had finally perforated the pleura. "We need a needle decompression," Natalie said quietly. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." "He's collapsing." Dr. Mercer stood slowly, and in that slow movement Natalie saw everything, the hesitation, the searching in his memory for something he'd read once in a textbook, the terrible knowledge that he didn't know what he was doing. His hands moved toward the crash cart but without certainty. Without the muscle memory of having done this before. His fingers found the trauma shears, then the needle kit, then put both down and looked at them like they might explain themselves. 58. 55. The oxygen saturation was free-falling now, the child's lips turning the color of a bruised plum. The commander made a sound, not words, just a father's raw awareness that his son's remaining system was shutting down. Natalie didn't wait. She didn't ask permission. She didn't defer to the hierarchy printed on the ID badges clipped to scrubs. She moved like she had in Kandahar, like she had in the Black Site Infirmary outside Tikrit where she'd done this procedure on a 19-year-old Marine with a sucking chest wound and nothing but field trauma shears and hands that knew exactly what to do. She grabbed the 14-gauge angiocath needle with her left hand, her right hand already prepping the skin with the antiseptic wipe from the crash cart, muscle and instinct aligned like a weapon being readied. "Keep him still," she said to the commander, and it wasn't a request, it was a command, the kind of voice that came from someone who had given orders in circumstances where hesitation meant death. The needle went in smooth and precise, angled 45 degrees, feeling for the give of the pleura beneath her fingertip. The practice from 100 trauma bays, from blood and chaos and the kind of pressure that separated people who froze from people who acted. 40 seconds. That was all it took. The needle sliding through, the catheter threading in behind it, and then the hiss of air escaping. That terrible beautiful hiss that meant pressure was equalizing, that meant the collapsed lung was expanding again, that meant the child was breathing. 41 seconds, and the oxygen saturation began to climb. 65. 70. 75. The monitors settling back into something resembling normal, the frantic beeping becoming regular again, the child's chest rising symmetrically now, left and right in balanced rhythm. Thomas gasped once, then breathed deeper, his small body remembering how. The commander reached for his son's hand, tears cutting down his face without sound, and Natalie was already reaching for the chest tube kit because a 14-gauge needle was a bridge, not a solution, and they needed to establish proper drainage before anything else could fail. "We need to get him to imaging," Natalie said, her voice already moving past the miracle to what came next. "Confirm placement. Then we need to talk about why this wasn't caught on his initial scans." That was when the room's temperature changed. Dr. Mercer stood very still, watching Natalie work with the steady competence of someone whose hands had done this enough times that her body didn't need her mind to participate. He was watching her establish a chest tube with the kind of precision that came from field hospitals and combat medicine, watching her work around his frozen silence like it wasn't even there. Watching the commander's gratitude crystallize into something darker, not just relief, but rage at what had almost happened, rage at who had been standing ready and who had been fumbling through medical school memories. Natalie didn't look at Dr. Mercer. Didn't need to. The silence was its own message, and in that silence lived the end of whatever careful distance she'd maintained. She had just overstepped so completely, so visibly, so undeniably in front of a Navy SEAL and his son that there was no protocol in any handbook that could contain what came next. By Monday, hospital investigators were already pulling her files. By Tuesday, they were calling her references, the ones she'd carefully constructed, the ones that were starting to contradict each other under pressure because fabricated histories couldn't withstand forensic scrutiny. A supposed supervisor at a clinic in Denver who couldn't quite remember the dates. A manager at an urgent care in Phoenix whose record showed no hire date for any Natalie Hayes. Small ruptures in the story she'd been ordered to build, the identity she'd been told never to deviate from. Captain Natalie Hayes was supposed to be invisible, permanently erased after the black site extraction, the operation the Pentagon swore never happened and would destroy her credibility if she ever tried to speak it. She was supposed to be nobody. Safe in her nothingness. Untraceable in her civilian camouflage. She wasn't supposed to save a 7-year-old child in front of a commander who knew exactly who she was. By Friday, the termination letter arrived during the afternoon shift change, effective immediately, for an authorized clinical intervention and scope of practice violations. She read it standing in the break room while the room's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Security was already being called. She had an hour to gather her personal items and leave the premises. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside the jacket lining in her locker, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat the entire time she packed her things into a cardboard box. Thomas Davidson stood in the hallway near the pediatric ward, his small hand in his father's, asking where the kind nurse went. The commander's jaw was set hard enough to break, his eyes tracking Natalie as she walked past carrying the box that contained 3 stethoscopes, a pair of trauma shears, and everything she'd built in 18 months of being someone other than a captain. She had to go, the commander said quietly, and his son's unseeing eyes turned toward the sound of her footsteps. "Will she come back?" the child asked. Natalie didn't answer. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because there was no safe answer to give him, not anymore. Dr. Mercer didn't wait for the board to act. He moved with the precision of someone who'd spent 2 decades learning how to dismantle careers from the inside, and by Monday morning, before the hospital's administrative wing even switched on the coffee makers, he was working the phones from his country club office, the mahogany-paneled room where real decisions got made, where whispers carried more weight than policies ever could. He had 3 board members on speed dial, men who owed him consultation fees and referral bonuses, and he called them one by one, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand, painting a portrait of a rogue nurse who'd exceeded her scope, endangered patients, and fabricated credentials to climb higher than her training allowed. "It's not personal," he told each one, which was precisely the kind of lie that worked best. "It's patient safety. She needs to be removed before something catastrophic happens." The references came next. Natalie's civilian identity, carefully constructed over 18 months by people who knew how to build ghosts, had weak points if you dug deep enough. Her nursing school transcript was real. Her license was authentic. But the earlier jobs, the employment history designed to create a believable backstory before Cedar Creek, had been fabricated by someone whose tradecraft was military grade but whose documentation had been rushed. Mercer hired a private investigator, a former cop who knew how to extract discrepancies, and together they began calling the hospitals listed on her resume. One reference confirmed she'd worked there. Another swore she hadn't. A third provided conflicting dates. Each contradiction was a brick in the wall Mercer was building, each inconsistency proof that Natalie Hayes didn't actually exist, or existed so poorly that her entire identity was questionable. He documented everything, timestamped each call, and forwarded the results to the hospital's legal department with a subject line that read, "Credential verification failure, potential identity fraud." By Wednesday, the hospital investigators arrived. Two of them, both wearing the kind of expressions that suggested they'd seen this before: disgruntled employees, stolen credentials, nurses who'd lied their way onto staff. They set up in a windowless office on the administrative floor and began their work with the methodical precision of people trained to find what wasn't there. They pulled every note Natalie had written over her 8 months at Cedar Creek Medical, comparing handwriting, analyzing her medical terminology, cross-referencing her assessments against hospital protocols. They interviewed staff members who'd been told to remember if Natalie had ever said anything unusual, anything that didn't fit, anything that suggested she wasn't what she claimed to be. The investigators weren't stupid, they were thorough, which was worse. They found nothing actually wrong. Her notes were cleaner than most. Her assessments were more comprehensive. But in an investigation designed to find guilt, the absence of evidence wasn't reassuring. It was suspicious. Why would someone with fabricated credentials be this competent? Why would someone lying about her background write like she'd had military medical training? The investigators filed their report, "Recommend termination pending credential fraud investigation." The letter arrived on Friday afternoon, delivered to her locker in a sealed envelope marked personal and confidential. Natalie held it without opening it, already knowing what it contained. The paper felt thin and disposable, the kind of thing that could end a life in a single paragraph. She read it standing in the break room, her hand steady, muscle memory taking over, the same neural pathways that kept her calm in firefights now keeping her calm in fluorescent-lit rooms where her career was being executed on company letterhead. Effective immediately, the letter read, "Your employment at Cedar Creek Medical is terminated due to credential verification failure and unauthorized scope of practice. Security will escort you from the premises. Your badge access will be revoked. You are prohibited from entering Cedar Creek Medical facilities pending investigation." 23 words. That was all it took. 23 words and 18 months of invisible work, of pretending to be ordinary, of learning to smile at the right moments and nod at the right comments and ignore every instinct screaming that she didn't belong here. All of it was erased. She didn't cry. That wasn't her mechanism anymore. Instead, she drove north on Interstate 37 at midnight, past the sprawl of San Antonio falling away behind her, until she found a chrome and vinyl diner that hadn't changed since 1987, the kind of place where nobody asked questions and the coffee came in thick ceramic mugs that never stayed warm long enough. She sat in a booth by the window, ordered coffee she didn't want, and watched the highway stretch away into darkness. The reflection in the glass showed her own face superimposed over the neon signs and the rain starting to fall, a woman in scrubs that no longer belonged to her, hands folded around a mug that felt like the only solid thing left in her life. The trucker at the counter paid in cash and left a tip. The waitress refilled coffee cups without being asked. The fluorescent lights buzzed with the sound of 1,000 nights that looked exactly like this one, and Natalie watched her reflection fade and brighten as the rain intensified, wondering if this was what invisibility felt like, not the absence of being seen, but the presence of being completely, utterly alone. 3 hours later, at 3:17 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from Commander Davidson. The words appeared in the dark like tracers in night vision, "Thomas's condition critical. Emergency surgery 5 a.m. Mercer won't consult the treatment protocol you left. Please. I'm begging you." Natalie's hand went to her chest, where beneath the scrub she was no longer allowed to wear, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, was the faded 75th Ranger unit patch. She'd sewn it into the lining of her jacket 18 months ago, the only physical proof that Captain Natalie Hayes had ever existed outside of classified documents locked in Pentagon servers. The fabric was worn soft at the edges, the emblem barely visible after years of sweat and rain and the particular degradation that came from being hidden. She pulled the jacket closer around her shoulders and felt the patch press against her skin like a reminder, or a wound, or both simultaneously, the weight of every identity she'd ever shed accumulating into a force that felt heavier than any ruck she'd carried into combat. She finished her coffee. It had gone cold while she sat motionless, the reflection staring back at her showing someone she almost didn't recognize anymore, not quite a nurse, not quite Captain anymore, caught in the space between lives. She paid cash and drove back to Cedar Creek Medical with the kind of focus that came from having already decided what happened next would end everything. Her termination had been effective immediately. Her badge was disabled. Security had been instructed to arrest her if she tried to enter the premises. She used the side entrance anyway, the one near the loading dock where the late-night deliveries came in, where security cameras had blind spots because nobody thought anyone would try to break back into a place they'd just been thrown out of. Her badge didn't work on the main doors, but the loading dock door had a mechanical lock that still recognized her magnetic strip. The door clicked open at 4:03 a.m. Inside, the hospital moved with the quiet rhythm of the night shift, monitors beeping in steady patterns, the hum of ventilators, the soft squeak of shoes on linoleum, the smell of antiseptic layered over something darker that she'd learned to recognize as fear. She found Commander Davidson in the surgical waiting room, his face carved from exhaustion and something that looked like prayer. He saw her slip around the corner and his breath caught. Before he could speak, she was moving down the corridor toward the pharmacy, then the supply room, her hands moving through the muscle memory of unauthorized access, of taking what she needed and documenting nothing. She prepared the treatment protocol that Mercer had refused to consider, the one Natalie had left in his mailbox 2 weeks ago, the peer-reviewed literature he dismissed without reading. 20 minutes. That's all she needed. She worked with the kind of silence that comes from having done this before in conditions far worse than a hospital supply room. The vials went into a sterile bag. The dosing calculations she'd written on a piece of scratch paper. The consent form that the commander signed with hands that shook, his permission to use an unauthorized treatment on his child because the authorized one was failing. She delivered it all to the surgical team at 4:48 a.m., slipping the package into the hands of Dr. Patricia Reeves, the anesthesiologist who'd seen Natalie work and who'd seen the results. One look at the protocol, one glance at the commander's signature, and Dr. Reeves nodded. No questions. She understood. Natalie was already turning to leave when Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the pre-dawn silence like a blade. Security! His hands were shaking as he pointed at her, his face twisted into an expression that looked like triumph finally realized. We have a terminated employee accessing controlled medications. But Natalie didn't move. She turned to face him with the kind of calm that comes from having already accepted the cost. The treatment was authorized by the patient's father and provided directly to the surgical team, she said, her voice level as a surgeon's hand. Your refusal to consider alternative protocols was documented. Multiple times. In writing. Which you should probably delete before the medical board sees them. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to understand that she wasn't afraid, long enough for him to realize that she'd never been afraid of him at all, and then she walked out through the same door she'd come in, leaving behind the scrubs she was no longer allowed to wear and stepping back into the darkness with nothing but the faded unit patch still pressed against her ribs, still beating like a heart that wouldn't die. The Pentagon security system flagged the anomaly at 6:53 a.m. Monday morning. A clearance that shouldn't exist. A nurse who shouldn't have won. Cedar Creek Medical's network lit up like a switchboard in crisis, and suddenly the administrators who'd signed Natalie Hayes' termination letter found themselves on conference calls with voices that didn't introduce themselves, didn't ask permission, didn't negotiate. Just spoke. And listened to what Cedar Creek's leadership stammered in response. The hospital's chief medical officer went pale reading the email thread. The director of HR stopped answering her phone. By 8 a.m., the entire morning staff knew something had shifted, though nobody could articulate what, only that the casual dismissal they'd witnessed 3 days prior had somehow become complicated in ways that made them straighten their spines and lower their voices. Commander Davidson found her in the parking lot at 9:15 a.m., his son holding her hand. Thomas had insisted on coming back to Cedar Creek for his post-operative checkup, had asked if Angel 6 would be there, and his father had carried him down to the parking lot where Natalie stood loading the last box into her truck, the equipment from her locker, her coffee thermos, the small things that accumulate when you live a life that isn't yours. The commander's voice came out like a prayer. Angel 6. Just those 2 words, but they contained everything: the memory of a night in Tikrit when rounds were tearing through darkness and someone's hands had pulled him from rubble, the gratitude he'd carried for 18 months, the knowledge that his son's life hung on the decisions this woman in scrubs had made while Dr. Mercer froze. His son reached up, touching the faded lettering on her hospital badge, and smiled without seeing. She felt the weight of that moment like pressure changing in the air around her. The emergency hospital board meeting convened at 11 a.m. 23 board members, 3 hospital administrators, 4 legal representatives, and a Marine colonel who'd flown in from Camp Lejeune on orders that came from someone higher than anyone in the room had authority to question. The colonel stood. He was maybe 55, with the kind of carved jawline that came from 3 decades of command, and when he opened the folder in front of him, his voice filled the room like an engine idling at exactly the right RPM. He read her Silver Star citation aloud. Word for word. For actions under fire in Tikrit, 2019. For extraordinary heroism in the extraction of 2 high-value personnel under sustained hostile fire. For decisions made under impossible pressure that had protected American lives. For a service record so clean it looked like parchment. The board members didn't move. They barely breathed. One attorney's pen stopped mid-sentence. Dr. Mercer's face drained so completely he looked like someone had cut his strings. Then the doors opened again. A 2-star general. Fort Sam Houston. Dress uniform with ribbons that climbed his chest like a record of every war America had fought in the last 30 years. He stood at attention, actually at attention, a 2-star standing like a private, and saluted. The kind of salute that meant rank and protocol and the absolute acknowledgement of something he'd recognized the moment he walked in. Natalie Hayes' decorations, kept in a storage unit for 19 months, had been retrieved. Had been verified. Had been honored in the way the military honored people who'd given parts of themselves that civilians couldn't see. Dr. Mercer's hand started shaking. Not from fear. From the realization that he'd been conducting a disciplinary action against someone whose security clearance required 3 levels of Pentagon sign-off, whose identity he'd tried to dismantle, whose career he'd attempted to end with whispered complaints and fabricated references. "This is absurd," Mercer said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "She's a nurse, this is obviously," but the 2-star general cut him off with the kind of silence that feels like a hand pressed against your mouth. The room held that quiet the way it holds its breath before a code. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The colonel's eyes met Mercer's with the expression of someone who'd just confirmed what he'd suspected, that incompetence and arrogance could exist in the same human body without canceling each other out. By Tuesday, Rodriguez arrived at the board chairman's office with a tablet and 17 years of IT experience. He was Army 2 tours, and he'd been watching Cedar Creek servers since Friday night when Mercer had accessed them at 11 p.m. "Sir, you need to see this. Security footage. 19 file access attempts. 1 deletion command, incomplete, because Rodriguez had already preserved the audit trail like a medic preserves evidence at a crime scene. Mercer's personnel computer. His mailbox. His search history looking for references that could contradict her story. Every timestamp documented. Every click a separate count against him. By Thursday, IT security had flagged 17 separate violations of hospital policy regarding unauthorized access to protected medical information. By Friday, the State Medical Board had filed a preliminary investigation. His country club board members stopped answering his calls. Previous complaints from other nurses surfaced, 6 of them, going back 8 years, all involving similar patterns, all suddenly brave enough to speak now that someone else had already broken the silence. His hands trembled when he cleaned out his office on Thursday afternoon. The same hands that had signed Natalie's termination. The same hands that had pointed at her charts and called her amateur. The same hands that had orchestrated the campaign to have her removed. They shook so badly he dropped his diploma frame, and nobody helped him pick it up. Colleagues passed his office door with their eyes fixed straight ahead. The exile he'd engineered for her had become his own prison, and the recognition of that irony moved through Cedar Creek Medical like a siren wailing in the distance, getting closer, impossible to ignore. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Mercer teaching CPR fundamentals at San Antonio Community College for $18 an hour. The community college where dropouts came to get a second chance. Where his hand still trembled when he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy that didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't have a family waiting in the parking lot. His name appeared on no hospital rosters. His network had dissolved like morning fog. Medical schools had added his case to their ethics curriculum as an example of institutional sabotage and how it collapses under its own weight. At Cedar Creek Medical, the surgical wing had been reconfigured. A new position. Military Medical Liaison. Civilian credentials, captain's bars visible on her scrubs, bridge between two worlds that didn't often speak the same language but understood trauma the same way. Commander Davidson's son came for his post-operative vision test exactly 6 months and 14 days after the needle decompression. His bandages came off in the clinic, and Natalie watched the light hit his eyes that had been dark for 7 months, that had learned the world through touch and sound and the voice of someone named Angel 6. She guided him through the eye chart, each letter a small victory, each number a line reclaimed. His small hands reached up to trace the outline of her face, and he smiled at the angel he could finally see. "You saved me twice," he whispered, his fingers finding the Angel 6 call sign on her shoulder where she'd had it tattooed in precise military lettering, not hidden anymore, not a secret anymore, just part of who she was. The commander saluted her in the hallway afterward, proper military courtesy that made every nurse on the floor stop and stare, tears in his eyes because he understood what Natalie Hayes had given up and what she'd finally reclaimed. Rodriguez stopped by her office with coffee and a knowing nod between veterans. The faded unit patch no longer hid inside her jacket lining, no longer pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. It hung framed beside her silver star, her identity no longer buried but displayed, proof that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. She watched Thomas run down the hallway toward his father, sight restored, life ahead of him, the weight of invisible sacrifice finally set down. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to, please like and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to remember that true strength often wears scrubs. And tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed injustice turn back on itself?